the workshop, so just pass it around throughout and give it to us at the end. Alright, so what we're going to be talking about is whips and deputies, so second speeches. They're my absolute favorite speeches in the entirety of the debate world, the best speeches. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about is basically, we're going to talk about three different things and we're going to do some exercises throughout. We're first going to talk about sort of like the most basic deputy and the most basic whip structure that we want you to follow throughout speeches. Second, we're going to talk a little bit about strategy. What are the things that you should be doing in deputies and in whips that will win you the debate? We're going to do some exercises specifically on weighing because we think that that's quite challenging. And lastly, we're also going to be talking about sort of like a more advanced things that you can start to introduce in your whips and in your deputies, which is asking questions about how to win debates. And we're going to sort of come up with questions together from a couple of motions, because that's something that you can start to do since very early moments of prep time, that just like makes your whips and your deputies so much better. Alright, so first on structure. So overall, how do you people structure your deputies? Yeah, how? Like, when you're doing a deputy, what do you do? Yeah?
Well, actually, we just kind of say again what the other team member said and kind of elaborate that. And also sometimes you have also may add a new argument and explain it way better.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that that's good. There's overall three things that I think every deputy speech should be doing. First and foremost, which is the one that you didn't mention, but I think is incredibly important, is responses. I think that your main job as deputy speaker is to give responses to the other side. Your first speaker gave out probably most of your material and your most important material. Your job is to not let your cases be just like opening op said some arguments and opening government also said some arguments, and I believe both of them, but I just don't know which one matters more or which one is more correct. What you want to do is to clash those together. So you want to give responses to what the other side said. I think that your responses should try to be, firstly, why the argument is wrong. Second, why the analysis is not right. And lastly, why even if the argument is correct, why you should still buy my case. So sort of like, why are other things in the debate more important?
There's 8 people here. There's more than 8 people in this room.
Yeah, do we have to decide immediately?
Yes. Yeah, and also the second debate. Well, for example, if I sign up for the second debate, are we all going to do the second debate or just our team?
Just your team.
Just your team. Just your team. You're making a decision for your team. But if you make a decision, you have to stick with it.
What does it mean? Like, how can some teams have less rounds than the others?
But this is not a tournament, it's just practice round. Okay guys, let's not lose time on this. So I want everyone to sign up for something. Either 1 round or 2 rounds. And let's do this now so people who haven't signed up. Yeah.
My teammate is Leon. He's in the beginning course. He was assigned to me because we didn't have a pair. So
he said 1 round. Everyone
said 1.
Everyone from the beginner said 1 round. If you want to, we will assign with them.
Okay. Ali dalje trebamo još.
Okay, so continuing on.
Sure.
Responses. Super important. You really need to say why what the other side is saying is wrong, or why it's at least less important than the things that your team is saying. So for example, on a motion about as a government prioritizing economic development over environmental activism, if one side says why like economic development lifts people out of poverty, you as the deputy speaker don't just want to be like it's wrong, you also want to say even if it's true, our argument about saving the environment is more important because like I don't know, like people in the future will depend on the environment and therefore we're screwing them over and they also matter and they matter more in the debate because there's potentially more of them, so they matter more. So you do want to give responses. I think that should be always the first part of every deputy speech. And you ideally want to make that, like how long would you say should you spend on responses on a deputy?
2 minutes?
I think probably
depending.
like, yeah, I think depends, but I think usually you want to spend like 3 minutes probably. Yes?
I don't know if you mentioned it earlier, but I always have this dilemma of whether should I start with elaborating what the first speaker said and then responding, or going straight to responding and then turning back to my point.
I think you should always do responses first. The reason for that is because I think that your previous speaker already spent most of their time doing arguments. So the thing that your team doesn't have at the moment is responses. So that's what you should prioritize. So first give responses.
Also, I think it makes harder if you're opening government and you're deputy prime minister. It's probably harder to respond to maybe something that you extend from your case if it comes after rebuttal, because then the deputy leader of the opposition has less time to, like, you know,
Think of things,
yeah, and stuff like this.
Yeah, so ideally you want to always start with responses. Probably spend like 3 minutes maximum on responsiveness. I think that an important thing to highlight it's coming around, yeah. I think that the important thing to highlight is that when doing responsiveness, and I think this is something that a lot of people miss, is that you still need to have some level of structure. Because I think some people sometimes do like a response and then it ends up being like a long stream of thought and it's like a giant paragraph and I have no idea what this person is responding to. So I am just like, this is very interesting, but I don't know where it fits in the debate. Like, is it responding to an argument? Is it a new argument? What's going on here? So it's important to always flag out what you're responding to. So be like, I am responding to their first argument. I have 2 responses. Then moving on to their second argument, I have 2 responses. Then lastly, their third argument that their deputy speaker brought 2 responses. So then you already have like structured, nice responses in like 3 minutes. So that's the first thing that every deputy speaker should always do. The second thing is, as you mentioned, bringing back your own material or introducing new material. Which one you want to do first is probably up to you. I would say that which one you do first depends on how good your new argument is. Because sometimes when you're a deputy, you just can't have like one argument and it's really kind of bad and you're just like, I'm just gonna say this because I need to say something. But if it's like pretty bad, then don't prioritize it and spend most of your time on it because it's a bad argument. Instead, bring back the other arguments that your teammate already brought. I think that the best way to do it is not to just repeat it, which I think is something that people tend to sometimes do. I think that the most useful way to bring back your arguments is to respond to the criticism that the other side already gave to your argument. So just be like, look, my partner said this, their response to this argument was whatever, here is why our argument still stands. Like, respond to the rebuttal. The second thing that you can do is if they gave no response. And if they gave no response to your argument, that argument is suddenly the most important argument in the debate because they said nothing, which means that you're winning. So explain more why it's a super important argument, analyze it more, flag out the fact that there was no response and that is a fatal mistake that the other side has made. So those are the 2 things that you can do. A, respond to the criticisms that they made, or B, flag out that there was no criticism, which means that screw you opening up, you're losing at the moment. The last thing that you can do is obviously bring out your new material, which ideally you should take like 1 or 2 minutes, equally like 1 or 2 minutes going back over your own case. Again, the important thing to flag out here is sort of like, again, keep some sort of structure, be clear as to what you're doing. So be like, first, responses. Second, talking more about what my partner brought in their previous speech. Lastly, moving on to my new argument that they have to respond to. So like a new argument. Is this more or less clear in regards to the structure of deputies? Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So then, whip speeches. Yeah, any questions on deputies?
Can you just highlight once again that structure of deputy speech?
Yeah, so ideally, also I think this is a good way to sort of start at the beginning of your speech. You always want to tell the judge what you're going to do. And that also gives you like a mental map to know what you're doing. So you'd be like, hello, I'm the second speaker of the opposition. Today I'm going to talk to you about 3 things. First, responses to their arguments. Second, I'm going to bring back my partner's material. And lastly, I'm going to bring out my new argument, blah, 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 whatever the title is. So those 3 things you want to do. Cool. Any other questions on deputies? Fabulous. So let's move on to whip speeches. So how do you guys whip? Yeah.
I have
two strategies. One, if it's a messy debate, I just go put like 3 main points that happened in this debate. And my other sort of strategy is like, ideally this needed to happen in order for someone to win debate. Here is why my team is the closest one to the debate.
Yeah, actually it's telling where the clashes happened in this debate and why your team was better. Like, if you are the government, you have to tell why the government was better, and like saying why in the government his team was better than the opposition team.
Okay, so I think that is one structure, that's sort of like going through the main things that were talked about in the debate. We're going to talk about that one at the end. Right now we're going to go over like one that I think is also quite useful, especially when you're not super sure what the clashes are. Because sometimes like a team talks about the environment, someone else talks about the economy, someone else talks about politics, the other about international relations, and you're like, there's just like, what? There's no clash, I don't understand what's happening. So in those situations, I think it can be quite challenging to find clashes. And I think that a problem there is that you sometimes spend a lot of time just thinking like, what are the clashes, how I'm gonna fit my arguments into the clashes, what do I do, instead of spending time on the actual content of your speech. So I think this is like a very useful sort of easy structure to get into that allows you to still put out content and show how you win. So whip speeches, they're my favorite speech out of second speeches. The reason why I really like them is because I think they're the best way to guarantee the position that you want in the debate. I think that whips are the best place to decide not just where you place in the debate, but also where other teams place. Because it's very easy to be like, yeah, like opening up is winning this clash, but we're beating opening up, so we win. I think that the easiest way to therefore do it is to sort of go team by team. So if I'm the closing government whip, the way that I would structure a speech in this way, I would go, first, I'm gonna talk about opening opposition and why their case falls. Second, I'm gonna talk about the closing opposition extension, why that's also not winning this debate. And lastly, I'm gonna talk about my own extension and why it's the best material in the debate. The last one is basically why you beat opening government, but you don't wanna say we beat opening government because that sounds shady. And they're, you know, your team, obviously, your side. But it's why you beat opening government. So in that regard, it's very similar, right? What you're doing is basically on each of those teams, you are doing first responses to their case. And second, if you have an argument that happens to be super relevant to the things that opening said, then you want to insert that as well. So for example, if your argument is the environment and opening opposition talks about the environment and the other two teams talk about different things, then you want to first respond to opening opposition and then be like, also, our extension talks a lot about this and it's better material because of reasons. Moving on then, so then you show why you beat opening opposition. Then you move on to closing opposition, and maybe you don't have an extension that relates to what they say, so you just give responses. And lastly, you whip your own extension. So how do you show that your extension is better than opening government?
Something that helped me here is the difference between closing whip, government whip and opposition whip. Specifically, in the ratio you are supposed to allocate to your diagonal teams and stuff like this. So if you're closing whip, government whip, sorry, that means you only have one chance to respond to closing opposition, because you don't have a speech after the opposition's whip, which means you are going to have to allocate more time on tackling down closing opposition speech, and your extension must do a better job of rebutting opening opposition. This is not the case when you are closing opposition, because you have two speeches to respond to their extension, to closing government's extension, stuff like this. Which means that in this case, you can rely a little bit more on your extension dealing relatively with closing government, and you can focus yourself more on opening government. Now these are some of the things that can save you in debate in terms of where the engagement on closing half is going to be the difference between spots and stuff like this. It's something that's valuable to bear in mind when you prepare the speech or when you do your team chemistry and team strategy and stuff like this.
I think that to add to that, when you're closing government whip, I think that the most useful way to sort of prepare for that is to literally leave like a full, in your notes, leave like 2 full blank pages that you know is just going to be responses. So that when the extension speaker stands up, you're ready to like write down responses to what they say, and you always start by that. First, responses to the new extension that we heard. Here's why it's out of the debate. And you need to, as Lovro said, allocate more time and be more aggressive in taking that down, because you're literally the only speaker who gets to deal with that. So any questions overall in the whip structure? Yes?
Is it wrong if, for example, if we deal like with the opposition arguments in one, for example, not to separate the opening opposition and the second opposition, but just to say like the opposition side argued more about this and this and this.
I think that's fine.
Sometimes, you know,
If they're the same, I think that's fine.
arguments that
Yeah.
both teams apply to.
I think that's fine. I think that if you do that, you just need to flag out that they're the same. I think that's also helpful in pointing out that they're derivative. So be like, first, I'm going to deal with the opposition bench because I think that they just brought very similar arguments. So let's talk about those arguments. You deal with those, and then moving on to my own extension, why it's the most important material in the debate, and that's how you beat your opening. If obviously the arguments are separate, then you do want to do the like opening opposition, now closing opposition, now my own extension. Does this make sense to everyone?
Yes.
Cool, fantastic. So that's overall sort of like the two basic structures that I think everyone should be pretty comfortable in handling in debates because they're the easiest thing to rely on in messy rounds, in debates where you don't really know the clashes, in debates where every team has separate and different material. So the second thing that we're going to be talking about, and here's where we're going to start doing some drills, is like strategic things that you need to be taking into account as a second speaker. So the first thing is obviously like the thing that Lovro said, that it does change how much time you allocate to doing things, particularly, no, it's fine, particularly if you're the deputy, sorry, the whip in the government side. There's other three things that I think are also quite important. The first one is responses, because I do think that teams oftentimes just forget to respond, which is bad because then you leave it up to the judges, like assuming that both arguments were proven equally, then it's up to me as a judge to decide which one I like more. And maybe I just don't like the environment, so like screw your case, I don't like it. It was true, you proved it, but you didn't respond to their side, and like I think it's more persuasive, so I'm gonna go for that. So you always want to do responses. However, and this is also important, is that you need to be careful with which arguments you spend more time responding to. Some arguments are just irrelevant or not very well made. You don't want to spend your entire speech just like destroying an argument that was never going to win the debate anyway. So for example, in an argument, in a debate about like, which debates have you done already?
Afterlife.
More money for welfare if kids do get good grades.
More.
And this house regrets, this house would prefer a world where people do not believe in the afterlife.
Okay, so like if it's like this house would prefer a world where people do not believe in the afterlife. Obviously, there are some arguments that are relevant, but if I make a sort of very badly made argument about how people not believing in the afterlife would lead to people taking care of trees better, it's not very well made, very well explained the way that I just said it. So you don't want to spend like 3 minutes of your speech just being like, she said this one thing and it made no sense. Because it didn't. But you don't want to spend all of your time responding to that. You want to strategically take the arguments that you think are important for their side to win. Yes?
What if you leave these arguments without responding to them if you think one argument is irrelevant? Do they still stand on the debate?
So I think that you should respond and be like, this is irrelevant, but I don't think that you should be like 3 minutes on analysis on why this argument is irrelevant and untrue. It's about the amount of time that you spend talking about arguments. So you always want to like respond to the argument, but you don't want to spend like, basically like respond to every single thing that they said in the argument, but rather just respond to the core of the argument and spend more time talking about arguments that are more important. Yes?
I think, just to, also, I think the better the debate is going to be, the less time you're gonna have to allocate on these things, because you're gonna have to respond to things that are really relevant. So from the context of this, like these things, then I think you can do less responses. But generally, like ideal is say why you're not responding, why it's as Lucia said.
Yeah. So just like instead of doing like 3 responses to this argument, just be like, next, the second argument, we don't think that is relevant to this debate. So moving on to the next one.
Yeah, I was just about to ask, it's just enough to say it is relevant, we can't talk about trees, and that's it.
Yeah, well, you can say, I think that just saying why it's irrelevant, right? So just be like, we don't think this argument is relevant, we think that this debate is talking more about how people feel about death and how individuals in their lives alter their behavior, but we don't think that they massively alter their behavior relating to trees, therefore this argument is not relevant. Moving on to the next one. So that's like 15 seconds rather than 3 minutes of responses. So just remember to respond to the most important ones. The second thing that we also think is important, and I think that Lovro feels particularly strongly about this, is that it's quite hard to win on rebuttal alone. The reason for this is because if you think about it, just like in terms of maths and time allocated, if a team spends 4.5 minutes developing an argument, you also have your own arguments, you also have your partner's arguments, so you are at best going to give it like 2 minutes of response. So it's like 4.5 minutes of analysis versus 2 minutes of response. The argument is very unlikely to be completely taken down. So the judge is still likely to believe some of that argument, which is why it's important that you also have your own constructive material and weighing as to why that argument matters less. So bringing back your own constructive is genuinely super important and not something that should be abandoned for the sake of just responding randomly.
This is something that maybe some of you have done world schools before. This is something that's different to this format. Because in world schools, if someone is proposing a policy and you almost completely destroy the efficiency of this policy, like you show that it's not going to work in 95% of the cases, you have a very strong chance of winning this debate, right? Because you engage with all of the arguments that Prof has brought in. While in BP, although you've done a huge job in terms of rebutting or mitigating, there's still this 5% of chance that they are doing something very useful, right? So you need to have your own, if you're opposition there, you need to have harms that we can weigh as judges or whatever to these 5% of the people that they still help after you've like moved the 95% of people from the debate. That's often the case where people do a lot of rebuttal, but they leave a very small amount of material standing from the opposite side. They don't have a lot of constructive, they don't rebuild it, and they lose, even though objectively they did maybe a harder job, but there's still something standing from the opposition or from the other side.
Yeah, so responses, like the reason why you use them is to make sure that the argument is less important than your own arguments, but you need to be realistic about the fact that that argument is probably still going to be there at the end, even if it's like a very small argument, so you still need your own material. The last thing, and I think this is the best thing that you can do as a second speaker, and also importantly, the way to win as an ESL speaker, because EPL speakers speak faster and can say more arguments and analyze them more in less time because they speak it as a first language. The way to win is to be like, it doesn't matter that you spend 4 minutes analyzing that argument because that argument is not relevant and my material is more important. So that's what in debates we call weighing. So that's what we're gonna try and practice now. So weighing is basically just this argument, like, so if opening government has an argument and you have another argument, is to explain why even if both arguments are equally true, why your argument is more important than the other, and therefore even if both are true, you win. Does this make sense? Okay, so now we're gonna do a couple of exercises on this.
Maybe if we first do a couple of ways in which you can do this.
Oh yeah.
Just like very briefly. So the first thing you can do, this is very simple. You've probably done all of this. You probably do this all of the time when you argue with your sisters, brothers, family, and stuff like this. Is that you weigh stuff depending on first the time span that this happens on. So if something is a short-term harm or benefit, it's obviously going to be less important than if something is a long-term harm or a long-term benefit. So I don't know, like in econ motions, if you can prove that this policy is going to have a huge economic growth, not huge, but like economic growth in short term, but in long term it's going to lead to a lot more crisis and a lot more instability in the economy, probably people are going to weigh this long-term instability over the short-term gain that you're going to have in GDP growth and stuff like this.
Another one I think is the number of people that it affects. So if one creates some harms, but you can show that that harm happens to a very small amount of people, whereas your argument has benefits and those benefits come to larger numbers of people, then I'm gonna believe that even if there's some harms, I think that the benefits to more people are more important. So play the numbers game.
So we have the short-term, long-term, we have the numbers game. The next one is intensity. So something can affect intensity, how strong the effect is. So something can, for example, and there's a difference. Something can be really small in scope. So it affects a small group of people, but it can affect them a lot, right? So that they either lose or gain a lot of money, that they are psychologically very good by this or very bad by this, that it affects their life a lot, they have to change a lot, blah, blah, blah. This is the intensity. So obviously, if the situation is that you're affecting the same group in terms of scope, how many people you're affecting, the argument that's going to be weighted stronger is the one that's going to affect them more than the argument that's going to affect them less, right? So it's similar to scope, how many people we're affecting, but how much are we affecting them is the intensity, like weighing that you can do.
Yeah, like, I think that that's also useful if you want to win the numbers game. So if I show that there's going to be a very small benefit to the middle class, and the other side shows that it's going to be very, very harmful to a small subset of people who are already really, really poor, then that's, even if it's a smaller harm or a smaller number of people affected, the scope of the harm is so great and the comparative benefits to people who are already kind of fine is just not worth the cost. The other one that I would say...
That's also a fourth one. Like if we prioritize, I always mispronounce it, vulnerable.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When we play with the intensity and we say that we harm this small group, can they come up with that we care about more people?
They can, but you can be like, yeah, but you're not giving those people a benefit that's a lot bigger. So I don't know, like, if I gained a benefit by shooting 2 of you, but my benefit was like, I gained like €100, then my benefit is not that, like, it's €100, but your harm is you died. So that harm, even if it's or like, no, that's a bad example, but if I shoot one person here, and that means that every single one of us gets €10, then more people are getting a benefit, but one person is getting a harm that is so big that it's not worth it.
So we weigh the...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you can weigh in between the things as well.
Yeah.
A little bit meta, but you can say scope is more important than intensity in this debate. And then you can explain.
Okay.
I would say that another one is when you have a principal duty to a particular group of people. So, for example, if you're comparing children versus adults and the effect that something has on children versus adults, you can say that even if adults have more benefit, we have a greater moral duty to children, because as a society, like, we brought them into this world because they don't have, like, they need to be taken care of, whereas adults can make their own decisions because children are sort of at our mercy, like, we control everything that they do. So we have a greater moral obligation to do things that are good for children, even if it means harming adults more. You can extend that to many things, like, I don't know, like, yeah, any group, right? Any oppressed group in society, you can be like, we owe them this, even if it hurts everyone else. We owe them this because we have oppressed, like, I don't know, like women, LGBT people, people of like different skin colors, people of certain ethnicity for so long. You can use this, for example, on like, I don't know, like Austria, which like invade a bunch of Balkan countries and did bad things, is like, yeah, sure, it maybe harms the Austrian economy, but it doesn't matter because Austria went in and fucked up everyone else's economy for a very, very long time. So they owe us this. And you can extend that for like many things. So that's a way to get away with, like, even if you have greater harm, we think that it's worth it because we have a moral obligation to help this particular group of the population. Do you think there's another one?
I think there's another one, and that is if something we're doing can be reversed or cannot be reversed. So the idea, or the argument that we're making. So the idea is, I always have examples about like economics. I don't know anything else. So it's different if you sell a house than if you rent a house, right? Because if you sell a house, I mean, obviously you can buy it back, but it's a more longer and difficult process than if you just rent out the house, and you can you know, like, just stop renting it out at some point. The same thing goes with arguments. If you can show that something cannot be easily fixed, cannot be reversed, because there's like a lot of cost associated with moving it one way to the other, then it's going to be a stronger argument than something that can be reversed fairly easily, right?
Can you give us an example?
Other than the house.
So I think there's. So for example, I think that there's a positive way to apply this and a negative one. So one, for example, is the classic debate of this house believes that it's better to have a weak democracy than a strong dictatorship. So then you can use that analysis to be we would rather have a weak democracy because in democracies, if something goes wrong, you can fix it. You can vote someone else. It's relatively easy. Whereas in dictatorships, maybe you look out and you end up with Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew and everything is nice. Or maybe you get a really crazy dictator who decides to do this one horrible policy, but then you can't fix it. The damage is a lot more permanent. So we'd rather have a weak democracy because it's easier to bring back the harm or the benefit. Conversely, you can also do a different thing. So for example, this house would... It's difficult to think of one that's not the house. Nothing. No, so for example, if you're establishing legislation, and one is this house would...
Let's do so this might be controversial, but giving Afro-Americans their state. So that's something that cannot be easily reversed. Once you give them a black secessionist state, you cannot just say, oh, bring me back the state, right? However, policies that may affect affirmative action and stuff like this are stuff that can be reversed, change when Republicans go to power and stuff like this. So in this regard, you can use it can be reversed as a positive side if you're having to prop that there should be a secessionist African state in the US.
Does this make sense? Yeah. Any questions on any of these? Cool. So now we're going to do a couple. So we thought that we'd give you a motion and ask this half to come up with prop arguments and this half to come up with op arguments. Just give a quick explanation of the argument. You don't have to develop it fully. And then we're going to ask you guys, depending on which side you're on, to weigh it against the other. Do you want to do an econ one?
Econ? Do you guys have a preference? Let's check this.
Yeah.
Do you guys want to do a specific, not specific motion, but maybe
a specific type?
Economy.
No.
But we are here to practice. Exactly my point.
Yeah.
Social justice.
Social justice? Do you want to talk about people of color, about women, about LGBT individuals, about women?
I think it can be so. Portray overwhelmingly positive stories about migrants.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so these half of the room, you're the proposition. This half of the room, you are the opposition. So the motion is...
So this house believes that the media should overwhelmingly portray migrants in a positive light.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, I'll repeat it. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it doesn't.
This house believes that the media should overwhelmingly portray migrants in a positive light. Migrants.
Overwhelming.
Overwhelmingly.
Overwhelming.
Someone pronounce it right, I can't.
Overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
This house believes that the media should overwhelmingly portray migrants in a positive light.
That means you have 90% of good stories and 10% of bad stories.
Migrants. Portray immigrants.
Immigrants.
Yeah, immigrants or migrants, whatever you want to call them.
In
Positive light. So you say we Mexicans in the United States, we should say that they're great always. And this side is no, something else.
Would it should be in the spotlight?
I'm sorry, I get messages.
It's a positive light.
Should we work together?
You can work together.
You can.
You can work on your own.
We're gonna give you
So this house believes that the media should overwhelmingly portray immigrants arguments in a positive light.
Yes, and you're on the opposition.
Okay, here's me talking.
So 5 minutes, right? You just have to come up with simple arguments.
Yeah. You don't have to analyze them, it's just kind of like this is the argument.
Claim.
3 sentences,
Almost
yeah,
claim.
a claim.
Okay, so not actually explaining.
No. You just have to be like, my argument is that this is going to happen. Just
Are we?
the argument.
Maybe not.
Enthusiasm.
This guy's a good whip. He predicted that. Did you hear what he asked? He's like, I already know what we are going to do. Maybe they didn't know. You know who I first saw this do? Me.
She's very nice.
She's not too nice. Huh? I like people who are nice. I don't like people who are not genuine. Sometimes I think she's not genuinely nice, but just nice to be nice. No, because I know Miloš
What other questions can we do? What topic should we do? Yeah, for like the next one, it's just
maybe IR. Because if I follow that correctly, like ask questions what should be
So overwhelming with questions.
I'll just put the one you want to do more first, and then so you first want the social policy. That's like one moment.
so like
Alright guys, like 2 more minutes and then we are going to start You want to do this regrets or you want to do this preference? Because if it's preference, this is going to maybe if it's regrets, then
public, we could have said
All right, guys.
Hi everyone. Okay. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna ask for 2 arguments from the proposition. So who wants to share an argument that they have? Okay, 1 argument. Go.
Given that immigrants often face problem with integrating with the culture, we believe that it is truly easier for them to integrate into a different culture because giving them a positive role model for they succeeded in completely different type of culture is much more easier for a whole larger.
Can you begin? Because
Sure. At the point in which immigrants have most of the problems integrating in different type of culture, we need this media portrayal because we need to show positive role models of people who succeeded in whole different type of culture. Thus, we can create much more bigger safe haven for a bigger amount.
Okay, so it helps integration because it gives people a role model.
Yes.
Okay, good. 1 argument. Another one at the back. What other arguments? Yeah, you go.
Well, this will lead to less violent crimes purely based on the racist views that you get from the media. Like, some crimes will still stay, but it will lead to a decay of violent crimes that are solely based on racial components.
Okay, so less crime and more integration. Cool?
This is how we usually do.
Yeah.
Do we have to rebuttal or
No.
give
So
arguments?
now from the opposition, I just want to hear 1 argument first and then another one. So also just 2 arguments. Don't respond to anything that they said. So what are the arguments that we get from the opposition? So give me one. Someone? Yes, you.
Okay, so we believe that if we do this, media basically loses its purpose because the whole point of the media is having a realistic view on what's happening around you and knowing people and knowing their lives. So basically, if we do this, we're totally okay with the fact that the media should portray the good side and the bad side and everything in between. We do agree with the fact that there's a...
Wait, stop there. No responses, just the argument.
Okay.
So
okay. So basically we just want a realistic portrayal and we believe that people should see both sides and an overwhelmingly positive portrayal could just take us to an unrealistic approach.
Yep.
And the people would not be in light of what's happening.
Okay, so basically we lose the purpose of the media should be objective.
Yes.
Cool. Alright, so another argument coming from this side? Someone else has a different one? Yeah, go for it.
Okay, yeah. So if the media starts talking, so like if the purpose of all this is to integrate the migrants into the society, if we start talking about them like in a very positive way, and like overwhelm the listeners of the media, we're actually like doing the opposite of what we like aim. So if we keep talking that like in a positive way, so these migrants do these good things, and then like it's in an overwhelming way, I wouldn't want to, like the society wouldn't want to integrate those migrants because exactly as the topic says, they would be overwhelmed.
If I can further elaborate this one. So first thing that was how doing so we lose trust. We lose the trust that people have on media. But why someone would like to overwhelmingly emphasize the positive activities of these immigrants in our country? That's because people don't like immigrants. They see them as thieves, as foreigners. And media would do so just to portray the immigrants as good people and not intending to do any harm. But as the house said, we're trying to achieve this, we can achieve a totally opposite result by making people even more the immigrants. Why so? Because we are giving a portrayal, fake portrayal, surreal portrayal to the people, and that's why people start seeing immigrants as people that have the support of all the media, and they are surreal and everything, and only it will support even more their beliefs that immigrants are just disguised thieves and bad guys. A similar analogy is with feminist radical feminists, when radical feminists make every issue a feminist issue, and now there are people in this world, when I'm part of that group, that every time that is talked about women's rights, I get just annoyed because of this. Every issue is feminist.
Yeah, like a media conspiracy, the social media justice warriors.
Basically, the people have this one side, they have immigrant neighbors, and they see what's happening all day long. And they know what's happening in reality, and then they go to watch the news and they see something completely different. It can lead to really bad irritation.
Yeah, also when they picture someone...
Wait, enough. That's good analysis. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next bit, because this exercise is not for you guys to come up with arguments, it's to practice weighing. So then, we have two arguments on the proposition side. Firstly, we have the idea that integration gets better because people get better role models, and we can integrate those individuals better because society just accepts them more. The second argument we have is that there's also less violent crimes that are based on this idea that these immigrants are evil. On the opposition, we have three arguments. We have one, the idea that we lose the value of the media because now it's a biased, unrealistic portrayal. Second, we have the idea that we also get less ability to change things because we say like, oh, all is fine, people are integrating. And the last one is that there's backlash because people see that immigrants aren't always so nice, but then they see the media portraying them in a different way, and then they get angry and potentially commit more crimes. So then what we want you to, yes?
Can I try to weigh in?
What?
The way in between the better integration and backlash.
Yes.
Let's explain the rule.
Okay, so the backlash does happen in the first generation, as it did with radical feminism. But the thing is that
wait. You will be a good whip speaker, but yeah, that's literally what we're about to do. So basically, what we want you guys to do now is what you started to do, which is we want you to, as the opposition and as a proposition, take one of the other side's arguments and weigh them against your own. So you can use any of the methods we already talked about. If you want to start, because you already started to do the short-term thing, then fine. But take any of the methods we used to not criticize or respond to the analysis, but assuming that both arguments were true, why it is that your arguments are more important than the other side's.
So you just compare the two. And also, I think it's fine if you compare two on the other side.
Yeah.
So if you compare one from opposition and the other one from opposition and say like, pretend this is closing, this is opening, you know, the whip stuff you're supposed to do.
Yeah, so just compare your arguments to the other side's arguments. So we're going to give you like a little bit of time as well to like think of some stuff to say on that, and then we're going to start with you.
Oh, so you want to do it? Okay. Yeah, you can.
Okay, so do you want to start?
So given that the backlash will happen, it happens short term. But we think that the long-term integration of immigrants into our society with less violent crimes really outweighs the backlash, the small backlash that will happen within the first or maybe even the second generation. Same thing happened with radical feminism, as they say. They do get a little bit of backlash, but they're actually making the changes that they want to change. And we're willing to sacrifice our image, and we are willing to sacrifice how society will look at us if we will achieve our goals of less violent crimes and less racism and less discrimination towards the immigrants that are coming to our country.
Yeah. Okay, very good, very good. So someone from prop, let's go with, let's go with you because you haven't said anything yet.
We have their argument of less violent crimes, and we have our argument that people are not going to believe media anymore. So how are this is going to happen when people are not going to believe media and what they say? So actually when they see people there doing bad things, they are not going to say, oh, let's not commit crimes, because media is saying that they are better. So actually the less violent crimes are not going crimes are not going to be less because people are not going to believe the things that they are showing.
Yeah, cool. So someone else from Gov? Yes.
I think the main problem is that there's this blind belief that people will lose for, like...
Which one are we comparing?
Yeah, which
comparing
arguments
the idea of easier integration with media loses purpose. I essentially don't think so, because comparatively people on both sides don't essentially believe in media because 21st century, like Alex Jones is considered the media, Fox News who is telling lies. Essentially media is telling a bunch of lies. Essentially it is important to weigh human life. And the thing is, there are a lot of immigrants. How are they going to be more easily integrated in society? I truly believe that people are, in a way, can be affected by when you see like there is this guy who succeeded, and I think it's much more easier for people to understand, to break this image if there is one success. And if we are pushing more and more success stories, I believe that not only do we have benefit for immigrants, essentially they are the most important, but rather at the people who essentially, yes, they already have some sort of disbelief in the media, but in this special sort of case, in order to understand different type of culture, you can see that people can change and assimilate in culture. So thus, I believe true comparative stays on our side.
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to talk about the second argument of the proposition. They said that this motion would lead to less crime. Actually, we believe that there is an extremely high risk that by having this motion going through, it could turn out to be the exact opposite. As we said, the media, if the media is portraying them in a really positive light, basically we're not having a realistic portrayal, therefore it's basically we're ignoring the bad side. And this could lead to them getting onto this, and like it is a lot easier to do something wrong or to do something bad if you know that no one is gonna notice, no one is gonna talk about it. So if they get onto the fact that the media is basically ignoring this crime and is ignoring the bad side, then that could lead to potentially more crime, and that's why we believe that this motion should not.
I think the second part was fine, but that's a separate argument. I think that you want to, in the weighing bit, focus on the first bit that you said, that it's actually going to, or like rather this policy has a very high risk of turning into a crime, and therefore why it's not worth doing. Like the second argument is fine, but it's just an argument, not necessarily weighing. But yeah, okay. So yes.
I'd like to weigh in the argument that the media will, we will lose our faith in the media, and the argument that refugees will be more integrated. Even if refugees are more integrated, I'd like to focus on the quantity of this argument. The refugees represent maybe 5% of the population, and the media, us losing faith in the media is 100% of our population. So even if you have this small benefit of improving lives of some refugees, it will damage a lot more by losing its faith on the media.
Okay, that's great. Can someone maybe do the opposite in intensity?
So people already don't trust the media as much, but with the intensity of the quality of living we will give to these immigrants, I think it's worth giving to the people, okay, like, here's one more reason not to trust media, because they already don't trust the media. People are already doubting the media, finding alternative sources of news. So here, you can have one more reason to not trust the media if that will lead to a better life quality, a drastically better life quality for all the immigrants that will come to our country.
See, this is why the book is the best pitch, because you do this all around. It's very nice. Yeah, you wanted to do one.
No,
And then,
something just to add. For example, can we say like the goal of the both government and opposition is to achieve the integration of these immigrants, but the way that we choose to integrate them is better because because we care about how our people of our country feel about this, and we have to prepare them to really welcome these immigrants in our country, but not to give them fake news or to just give one side of the story, you know, just the positive side of these immigrants.
Yeah, you can do that as well. So like both sides want the same thing. How do we get there?
Yeah.
And
but
then
the path that we choose is better.
Yeah, I think that's fine. And it's sort of like effectiveness, short-term, long-term thing. But yeah. Okay, so this is more or less what we want you to try and do in every whip and deputy speech that you do. Because again, you can do responses, you can do your constructive, but it's really important to show the judges why, even if they don't buy your responses, they still think that your arguments win because you explained why they matter more and they should be valued more over the material the other side has said. Cool. So now we're going to move on to the last bit of the workshop, which is asking questions. We already went over two sort of structures that you can do when you're doing whips and deputies. A slightly different one and more advanced one is to start asking questions that you think will win you the debate. This one I do think is more challenging, and I do think that if you're not certain of what the questions are, I wouldn't attempt it. But I think that it can be very useful because it paints a very clear narrative of why you win. If you go, these are the two questions that I think are integral to us winning the debate, and I'm going to answer them in my speech. So, for example, in this one, do we achieve better integration? And is the short-term backlash worth it because in the long term we get better and less like quality of life and less violence? So if I answer both of those questions positively, then I win. If I prove that I have better integration and that also there's not that much backlash. So I think that therefore makes it quite easy for judges to sort of follow what you're doing. When you do those two questions, you normally just put within them the responses to the other side. So let's talk first about integration if you're government. The opposite side told us that there would be less integration because people would no longer trust the media. A bunch of responses. Even if this argument is true, we still think that like ours is more important because backlash is only a short-term thing, whereas this is going to be a more long-term benefit. What is that long-term benefit? And then you explain your case, and then just quickly answer why it is that you win the question. So really quickly, do we get more integration? Yes.
I wanted to ask something related to POIs, and even though I'm fully aware that it might be beyond the scope of this lecture, I think that POIs are really like one of the only means for the whip speaker to be engaged before his speech, and it's something that really is kind of problematic for me because I would just ask for some small tips relating to POIs. For example, how to frame and make a good constructive POI without giving away your points as a whip speaker.
Never make your POIs related to the extension. I think that you always want to make your POIs responses. So you always want to make your POIs criticisms to what the other side is saying. That's one thing. The other thing that I would do in POIs is you want to ask them concessions or trip them up. So for example, if you are like, I don't know, like, you know how Notre Dame burned down. So like this house would take the money that was given by rich people to Notre Dame and instead use it to feed starving children in Africa. Then if you're closing up, you can POI the government, sort of like, would you take all of the rich people's money and redistribute it everywhere, like just all of their money? And if they say yes, then you can be like, that's terrible, socialism, ha! And then if they say no, then you go like, they are inconsistent. They are saying that they would take only this very specific amount of money. We don't know why only this money? So sort of like ask questions that either are responses to their arguments and be like, that argument is untrue, you need to deal with this criticism, or ask questions that will trip them up. Alternatively, you can just ask troll POIs and be like, but have you thought about Notre Dame's impact on religion in France? And then they're going to have to come up with like a 1-minute response and waste a lot of time doing it. So those are the 3 things I would say. Okay, so continuing on, asking questions. This is more like not necessarily in regards to, if you want to talk about POIs, do come to us after. But on the asking questions, I do think that it's useful to do in both whips and deputies, and both are basically the same thing of like, I'm going to be talking about 2 questions that I'm going to be answering in my speech. First question, second question, and then you just fit in what the other teams have said and also what you have said, and you answer those questions positively to your side. What we wanted to do is we wanted to go through some motions and ask you to come up with what questions do you think you need to answer in order to win the debate. The reason why we think this is easier to do than clashes is because clashes depend very much on the debate that happens, whereas questions you can begin to ask yourself since you get the motion basically. So since prep time as a whip speaker, you can be thinking, what are the questions I need to answer? So you already have sort of like a kind of structure that you're working on when you're writing your whip across the debate. Does this make some sort of sense? Okay. So we're gonna do first one motion. This house would teach STEM subjects instead of the liberal arts. Instead of liberal arts.
Which was the first one?
This house would teach STEM subjects.
What's that?
Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
Subjects.
Instead of liberal arts. So you wouldn't teach like theater or literature or German to children. You would only teach them STEM subjects.
Are we positional?
Okay, let's say we are all on government. We say screw liberal arts. We only want science and maths. So, what questions do you think you need to answer in order to win this debate?
Why STEM subjects are more important than liberal arts? That we have to teach them only STEM subjects.
Okay, so why are some subjects more important? Yeah.
I think we need to assume that focusing more time on STEM will lead to technological advancement. We need to answer the question, is sacrificing liberal arts worth the improvements that we're going to get from that?
Okay, but I think that that's more, so like, those are both true, right? But those are more or less the overall question that the debate is asking, right? The debate is like, do we value more STEM or liberal arts? What do you think is going to lead me to believe that it would?
Diversity of maybe scholar system.
That's for the other side, I would say. So I think that one is the thing that you said, sort of like innovation. Are we going to get more innovation on our side if we only teach STEM?
I said that I'm going to assume that the previous speaker of my team took the innovation as an argument.
Yes.
So I think that as it is proven. So the question that I'm going to try to answer in my speech is why are the innovations we're going to get worth sacrificing the liberal arts? Like,
Yeah, so why is innovation more important than other things? What other things would we, why else would this be a good policy to do? Or what do you need to answer?
Why are liberal arts stopping us from technical improvement?
Okay, so is innovation the most important question in this debate?
I mean, if we are talking about
I would
innovation.
say the satisfaction of the students who study this is also important.
Okay, yeah, so I think that the most important thing is students, because the motion is mostly affecting children, right? So, is this going to be good for children? And then, depending on which side you're on, you can be like, yeah, it's great, they're going to be so smart, they're going to learn all the science, they're going to be able to get better jobs, because it's really hard to get a job as a like English lit degree, but it's really great and easy if you're like, I don't know, like quantum physicist or an engineer. You can talk about those sort of things. And then you can second ask sort of like, is the innovation that we're going to get worth the potential loss of the liberal arts?
We are not putting at risk the will of students to study STEM because if we actually liberal, okay, never mind. Yeah. I was thinking something with the
Okay, so I think that those two questions are pretty solid, right? So one is like, does this give...
Okay, just let me just say that because it works. Okay, so I was thinking that there are students who don't go to liberal arts school because they don't like STEM, and due to this STEM subject, their enthusiasm for school just decreased. So if we incorporate this STEM subjects into school instead of liberal arts subjects. Then we put across the enthusiasm of students and the eagerness of them to study and learn. And we can compare here the intensity of what we want to achieve. So we want to achieve an innovation that is possibly achievable after 15 years, but at the same time putting the risk at risk, the enthusiasm of students, which will make us maybe not reach that innovation, not right now, but not even after 15 years.
Yeah, so I think that that's a good argument, but it's not a question.
Okay.
I think that it's an argument that you fit within the question. So if the question is this good for students?
Okay.
Then you can say it's good for students because it's good learning. And then the second thing is exactly what you said, right? It's good for students because, or like if you're on the op, it's not good for students because it kills their enthusiasm and love for school. So I think that overall, as a general tip, usually there's two questions that you can always ask in pretty much any policy debate. One is a principle question, and second is a practical question. So basically, is this legitimate? And second, is this good for society? You don't want to ask those questions specifically, you want to be specific to the motion. So in this debate, for example, as you said, it is like students like liberal arts, they choose to do it. So are we legitimate in removing the choice of students to study liberal arts? And then we can say why we are or why we aren't. And secondly, is this overall going to be good for students? And then if you answer those two questions, on whichever side you're on, you won. Because if government shows me that it's legitimate to remove the choice and that it's also going to be great for the students, then we should do the policy. But conversely, if the opposition shows me that it is illegitimate to remove from students the ability to study arts and theater and literature, and that it's also not going to be good for students because it kills their enthusiasm, then you win. So it's just sort of like the two questions that you need to answer on either side to win the debate. And you don't, like, we didn't even have to prep arguments to come up with those questions. Does this sort of like make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. So let's do,
There were two questions. The first one, principal question, and the other one was?
A practical one. So I think that's a sort of solid start point of where you can derive your questions from. The only thing I would say is you want to make them specific.
I guess the second question, the practical one.
Yeah.
By that, the underlying message is how pragmatic the solution is, I guess.
Yeah, how pragmatic the solution is. And I think that in particular, you want to ask it in regards to like the thing that the motion applies to. So in this case, is it good for students? Okay, so now we're gonna do the last motion for trying to ask questions about it.
Yeah, so a little bit of international relations for the end. So the motion is this House, as the United States, would pull out of Syria. Pulling out meaning pulling out troops out of Syria. So this House, as the United States, would pull out of Syria. So we did gov, maybe we do up here.
Yeah, let's be up. We shouldn't pull out of Syria. But what questions do you need to answer to show that we shouldn't?
Why it would be damaging to Syria if US pulls out?
Yeah. Would it be damaging for Syria if the United States pulled out?
And what significance has Syria for the US and what significance would have if US would pull out the troops?
Yeah. So like, obviously the motion is from the perspective of the USA. So if you show that losing Syria would be terrible for the United States, then you win as well, right? So then you have like, one, is it good for Syria? Second, is losing Syria in the interest of the United States? Yeah, I like those two questions. Can people come up? I think that there's maybe another one. Yeah, at the back.
The practical question was like dealing with the interest of USA. We can make the same question, taking into consideration a more general stakeholder, let's say. For example, is pulling out of Syria really going to stabilize the geopolitical situation in the Middle East?
Yeah. So like it's pulling out of serious thing, geopolitics. Yeah, I think that's good. I think that if you really wanted to, there might be like a principle one, but I do think that this one is more heavily practical. Do you have a...
Is it morally okay to let a country potentially go to hell if you can stop it somehow?
Yeah.
As the strongest military force in the world.
Yeah, you can ask like, is it acceptable
morally
for the United States
not
to do?
To be involved.
Yeah. I think that that's very good
question,
phrasing.
yeah.
Is it morally okay to not be involved in the conflict? And then second, like, is it going to be good for Syria? And lastly,
stop human casualties.
Yeah, exactly. Is it going to stop terrible things happening in Syria? And then is it going to be in the interest of the United States to essentially lose Syria?
Also, since we're talking about like a pulling out thing, then the question is also, is it going to make things worse or better?
Yes.
Right?
Cool. Yeah, I think that you guys are basically getting the hang of it very easily. So then, with these 3 questions, if you're a deputy speaker, your prime minister your leader of opposition probably already spoke about why it is terrible that the United States is so powerful, yet refuses to save lives, why it's going to be really bad for the status of the country, why it's going to lead to like worse disasters, and also why it would be really bad for the United States if they lost Syria, because then like Lebanon or Russia or Turkey would gain more power there, and you don't want that. So then those are the 3 questions you ask, right? 3 questions in this speech. 1, blah, 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 second, that. If you're a whip speaker, you can equally do those 3 questions. And just like insert responses to the other side and also your own material within those questions. I will say that if you're doing this, it can get kind of messy. So the thing that we said at the beginning about sort of flagging out where you are at and what you're doing is important. So you want to be sort of like, first question, is it morally okay to not be involved in the conflict? First, responding to what they said. Why is my argument better and more important? So overall, we don't think that it's morally okay to not be involved. Moving on to my second question. But at all points, you're sort of flagging what you are and what you're doing.
The structure of the speech, it would be okay to frame those questions as this and that question. On to my first question, which answers the clash from there and there?
I think that the questions are essentially like what the clash should be around, right?
But just to say it out loud, to have the structure, like to be more easier to like.
Can we use these questions? Can the leader use these questions to give out
in order
arguments?
for us to win this debate,
just make it more easier to follow, like. On to my first question is this, which answers the clash from the opening side of the table. So it's easier to track.
Yeah, you can do that.
Even the leader of opposition can use these questions, but he should be more selective because not every single question is beneficiary for him and his team.
Yeah.
So he should be more selective and careful.
Yeah, so
using these questions as main points of your speech.
Yeah, I think that the leader of opposition trying to condense the debate so fast is not always a good thing. I think that also you're going to spend more time outlining what the questions are instead of developing analysis. So I think it's fine to leave it up to your deputy to actually put the questions out there. Again, this is, I think, a more complex one. So if you're not super confident about the whole question thing and how to structure it, do stick to the one that we talked about at the start. Are there any questions on this? Fabulous. And I think,
we're done.
Yeah, that's all.
Thank you for the attention.
Thank you for the attention.